Don't fear, West Ham fans. Daniel Kretinsky has apparently been in town and he's finally going to save our great club. But is he, though? I do ask myself at times whether I try to look too deeply into the headline stories and whether I should just report them as they're presented without any scrutiny. Other channels seem to do that. I'm quite happy to do so. It's content, I guess. So why not just report a story as it is without trying to question whether there's any substance to that story or not? Look, I'm not criticizing other channels. Please don't get me wrong. I'm not criticizing them from doing that. But sometimes I read a headline and immediately say to myself, that sounds like utter nonsense, or at the very least, not very credible. So I try to dig deep to establish whether the story really is as good as the headline itself. And usually I establish that the story really isn't that great. So let's talk a little bit about Daniel Kretinsky, shall we? He's had his fair share of headlines this week. Apparently, he's had enough. Another headline, the board is split. Another headline, there's a power struggle going on. And apparently he's been in London for showdown talks with the rest of the board members. Rightio. Look, before I carry on, if you're new to the West Ham Voice, or if you've watched this channel before but yet to become a subscriber, it's up there. There's a QR code that you can click on, which will enable you to subscribe to the channel. And once you subscribe, next to it, there's another button called Join. And if you wish to do so, you can become a member of the channel as well. But at the very least, if you don't subscribe, if you enjoy this show, please at the very least hit the like button. So, before I carry on with Kretinsky, actually, something else did come up on Friday, which is worth mentioning. The latest story is that another shareholder, Tripp Smith, has apparently been in London. He was in London last week, which involved him meeting potential US investors into West Ham. Now, whether this investment involves the gold shares or more than the gold shares, apparently maybe a suggestion that they may be looking to buy the club outright, I really don't know. But as soon as any more information comes of that, if it does, of course, I'll bring that to you. So let's get back to Kretinsky, shall we? He apparently flew to, I don't know how true this is, but he apparently flew to London last week to have talks with the rest of the board over current club predicaments. And that one of the discussions was about a managerial replacement. And from the names that he was actually being given, he said no to most of them, except for Nuno's. Now, look, let's be honest here. It's not unusual for board members to discuss such big decisions like managerial replacements. I'd be far more worried if that didn't happen. So I don't think there's anything odd in that. But in addition, apparently Kretinsky wants his own man. And that person is Fulham's Marco Silva. But apparently the board are at odds or fearful of the value of the compensation that Fulham would want in order to let Marco Silva go. Apparently, it's been mentioned that it's something like £8 or £9 million. Well, let's be accurate here. That figure was bandied around about a year ago when Silva had just under 2 years left on his contract at Fulham. Now, he's only got a year left, and unless Fulham get him to sign a new deal, the level of compensation will be nothing like £8 or £9 million, given that he's got under a year left of his contract. It will be circa more like £4 million. That's still a significant amount of money, but it's not an insurmountable amount of money. If Daniel Kretinsky really wants Marco Silva, with the greatest of respect to a lot of us, £4 million to him is loose change, and it can be done pretty quickly. And the fact that it's not being done, or not being done yet, seems to suggest that this headline of Kretinsky being at odds with the rest of the board members is simply sensationalism rather than a reality. And another thing worth remembering is it was widely reported that it was Kretinsky who had pushed for the signing of Tim Steidten a few years ago. Yet, even if that was true, when it came to deciding whether Steidten should stay or be sacked, Kretinsky seemed to have no influence on that decision. But managerial decisions aside, would Kretinsky be the solution to West Ham's problems if he were finally to take full control of the club? I'm afraid the answer to that is no, and I'll try and explain why. Since buying his 27% stake in West Ham, 4 years ago, we're still waiting for billionaire Kretinsky to finally take full control of the club and put us out of our misery that we're all suffering under David Sullivan. The truth of the matter is, if Kretinsky really did want full control, he's had that golden opportunity for the past 2 years to do so, because all he has to do is simply buy up at least 12% or more of the Gold family shares that have been up for sale for the past 2 years. You see, 12% would give Kretinsky a total ownership of 39, shareholding of 39% at West Ham. That'd be 0.2% more than what David Sullivan currently holds. And it would give Daniel Kretinsky full control of the club and will put an end to the supposed power struggle between him and David Sullivan. 39% ownership of West Ham will allow him to make his own decisions on whether we need a director of football again, on whether the board interfere or not on footballing decisions, on which manager we bring to the club without having to go with every decision David Sullivan seems to make. But he hasn't done it, and he's unlikely to do it. But even if he did, would he really be the man to take West Ham to the next level? Again, I'm going to have to explain why I don't think so. Look, there's no doubt Kretinsky is one of the wealthiest men in Central Europe, with a fortune built through his energy company EPH. He's also a media mogul with stakes in newspapers like Le Monde in France, and he's recently bought out the Royal Mail here in Britain. But for football fans, the key fact is this: he's been president and co-owner of Sparta Prague for nearly 2 decades. And since 2021, as we all know, he's a major shareholder and director at West Ham. So we're dealing with someone who isn't just dabbling in football, he's deeply embedded in it. And when Kretinsky took control of Sparta Prague in 2004, at the time, Sparta were already the most decorated club in Czech football. But under his ownership, the story has been somewhat mixed. On the positive side, he's investing heavily in the infrastructure. Sparta are planning to build a brand new 35,000-seater stadium, which will be built in the next 5 years, and it's projected to be worth around 5 billion Czech koruna, which is equivalent to 180 million pounds. Sounds extortionate, but there you go. But that's a long-term vision, showing that he's willing to put money into the club's future. Sparta have remained competitive domestically. They've won the league titles, most recently in 2023, and they continue to produce top Czech talent. But here's the flip side. For much of his tenure, Sparta have struggled to dominate the way they once did. And rivals like Victoria Plzeň and Slavia Prague have often outperformed them, both domestically and in Europe. Fans have criticized him for being too cautious with spending on players, preferring financial stability over bold investments. And whilst Sparta have had moments in European competitions, they haven't really re-established themselves as a consistent force on that stage. So the verdict on Sparta? Well, Kretinsky has kept the club stable. He's modernizing his infrastructure and he's ensured it remains big in Czech football, but he hasn't turned them into a European powerhouse. Now, let's bring this back to West Ham. And since Kretinsky bought his 27% stake, what exactly has changed at West Ham? Well, first, the things we don't see. Financial stability. It's given the club financial breathing room, especially during the COVID pandemic. That's no small feat. Second, ambition. West Ham have been competing in Europe consistently, three years in a row. And of course, we won the Europa Conference League in 2023. Now, whilst Kretinsky can't take all the credit for that, his presence, I guess, has added some weight to the boardroom. But here's the catch. He's not the majority shareholder. David Sullivan is, and David Sullivan calls the shots. And Kretinsky has, so far, shown very little appetite to take full control, as I've already mentioned. Now, there's another wrinkle: UEFA's rules on multi-club ownership. Because Kretinsky owns Sparta Prague, if both Sparta and West Ham were to qualify for European competition, it could create a conflict of interest. UEFA has clarified that for now, there's no breach, but it's a potential headache down the line. Not that this is likely to happen anytime soon. And as we've seen from owners of other clubs, there are ways around this anyway. So what lessons from Sparta apply to West Ham? Well, if you're hoping for a sugar daddy who'll splash hundreds of millions on transfers, Kretinsky's track record suggests that this is highly unlikely. But if you want a steady hand who values infrastructure, sustainability, and long-term planning, then his Sparta model might actually be quite assuring to West Ham fans. Now, let's make the case for being optimistic. He's financially solid, net worth of what? £7 billion. So by rights, West Ham shouldn't go bankrupt under his watch. He's shown at Sparta that he's willing to invest in facilities, and West Ham could benefit from that kind of vision, especially with the ongoing debates about the London Stadium. But so far, 4 years down the line, he hasn't really shown his hand to suggest that he'd be willing to invest in the London Stadium in order to improve the atmosphere. I know we don't own it, but any improvements would, I would guess, have to come out of West Ham United's coffers. So he's got the money, but he hasn't offered it. Now, look, he's not a reckless owner. In an era where clubs can be destroyed by bad investments, caution isn't necessarily a bad thing. But I would be interested to know what he thinks of the club, the way we've spent our money over the past few years, because it's not necessarily been that wise, has it? Now for the counter argument. Sparta fans, as I've said, accuse him of lacking ambition on the pitch. And it seems that West Ham fans face the same frustration if he prioritises balance sheets over bold signings. His divided loyalties between Sparta and West Ham have already limited how far he's willing or able to go with West Ham. And finally, he's not fully committed. With only 27% stake, he's influential, but he's not decisive. Unless he takes full control, his impact is always going to be limited. So is Daniel Kretinsky a good or bad thing for West Ham? Well, the truth is he's neither saviour nor villain. His track record at Sparta Prague shows that he's a stabiliser. He's not a gambler. He'll modernise where he can. He'll invest in infrastructure, and he'll keep, hopefully, the club financially healthy. But he doesn't necessarily deliver the kind of on-pitch revolution that fans dream of. For West Ham, that could mean a future of steady growth, but perhaps not the leap into the elite that maybe some fans might crave. The real question is whether West Ham fans value stability over ambition, because with Kretinsky, you're likely to get the stability rather than the ambition, which seems to reflect the way David Sullivan runs the club as well. But the reality is that Kretinsky will continue to look at the pragmatic way and trust the figures on the balance sheet rather than investing heavily to influence the future direction of this football club. Now, of course, if he feels that his investment is in danger, maybe because of the danger of relegation, then I dare say he'd want to have more input. But as I've said before, his 27% stake in West Ham means that all he can try and do is influence rather than make real change. It's going to be interesting to see how things pan out and whether Kretinsky does get his way to have Marco Silva at the helm. But it's looking ever more likely that yet another manager who's out of work is about to take over.